Anthony Stansfeld, Crime and Police Commissioner in Thames Valley, who led the charge to bring HBOS Lloyds to book on the mis-selling and on the criminality of the way that bankruptcies were handled. And Ian Fraser, who's with me here in Scotland, a forensic journalist when it came to following the cold trail the banks had left, and author of the book Shredded, which is the best detailed analysis of how RBS behaved and how RBS effectively screwed its small business customers. RBI now, despite the fact that they've changed the names, and RBS is no longer RBS, they're still there and they're still working away. And also we have my old friend and colleague, Samir Mahanovic, who directed Spank the Banker and who is the leading force behind Paradiso Films, which is a film company here in Scotland, but also globally, which makes films that matter, where we try and explore issues that have been ignored by the mainstream media and try and give people who have been affected by banks, by racism, by war, we try and give those people their own voice. And I hope that we managed in some way to do that with Spank the Banker tonight. So given it's been a couple of years since we did the film, indeed some of the people who you saw in the film actually got some, reasonable, not complete, but they got some reasonable response from the banks and got some restitution. But in the main, not that huge amount has changed. So Anthony, I mean, in the last couple of years, have you seen any sign that that Lloyds, for instance, Lloyds HBOS, has been made to own up to its sins and provide some restitution? Where are we with them?
I've seen very little evidence, really, of that. I mean, since I can't remember. I think Sally Masterton was paid compensation for the Turnbull report, I think, after the last meeting of this. Lloyds denied for about 4 or 5 years that the Turnbull report, they said it was not authorised. That was a lie. I mean, I have the emails between their head of audit and risk and Sally Masterton discussing it. They said it wasn't substantiated. Well, absolutely nothing anybody had seen in it was not substantiated. And lastly, they said that basically she was a bit unstable, which certainly wasn't true. They ruined her life for 3 or 4 years. So I think that has been sorted out. But of course, yet again, there's been a draconian non-disclosure agreement put on her, which I think is unacceptable. Lloyds say they paid out about 100 million. Well, the fraud, we prosecuted only on 245 million. The fraud was probably about 850 million. It was unusual, the HBOS fraud, that I don't think it was the same as what went on in Lloyds itself, in that not only were there the clients of the bank being taken to the cleaners, but the bank was itself, and basically the very simple premise of that fraud was they would deliberately call in loans on companies that had overdrafts, which they were quite capable of paying and always had. They would bankrupt the company. Well, they put in their own directors into the company, insist upon it, milk the company for every penny, and then ask the bank, where they had their own people working, for more loans. So the bank was losing money as well, which I don't think happened in the other frauds that I have seen. But the 100 million they paid out was only to those cases that actually came up in the court case. And if we had prosecuted the entire case, we'd still be sitting in court today. I think it was so huge. And for the jury to understand it, we wouldn't have got heavier sentences. And they haven't really paid out consequential losses either. And again, everyone has been given an NDA. Well, if you're fairly elderly and you've really been in poverty because all the money's been taken off you by a fraud committed by a bank, and they give you a take it or leave it offer with some money back, I think on the whole, most people will grasp at it because otherwise they're going to get nothing back. And the Sir Ross Cranston report, which of course only covered a small part of the fraud, but he again said some of the behaviour was unacceptable by the bank. So that has gone on. But I think the main thing that has happened since then is the assembling of 21 very large, heavy files with over 500 cases in which people are being bankrupted on the back of forged documentation. I mean, the frauds are absolutely blatant in most cases. Not only the signatures, you'll get one person with a huge different number of signatures, or a largest number of different people, all with the same signature. And the bank may say, oh, this is just signing for other people on documents. But if you're bankrupting people in court, you actually want the person who is actually swearing that it's true, if they're putting in written documents, to actually sign the document. In America, they tried it and they were fined $25 billion, the biggest bank fines ever. But also the documents are false guarantees. They're running parallel bank accounts. One favorite trick is opening bank accounts in people's names without them even knowing about it, giving that in that account, giving it a very large overdraft, lending it, say £10 million or something, then charging it 15–18% interest. And the poor client doesn't even know he's got the account. And so it goes on. Now,
why are the fraud authorities not doing something about this?
Well, what fraud authorities? When did somebody last prosecute a major fraud? The FCA hasn't prosecuted one for years. The National Crime Agency, I don't think, has ever prosecuted one, and the SFO doesn't do them very often. And the police forces simply cannot afford it. And I think since we last had a meeting, the FCA eventually got round to fining Lloyds, I think it was 60 million for their behaviour over the HBOS case. But they then immediately gave them a discount of 15 million for being so cooperative. Well, they certainly weren't cooperative with the police investigation. And that 45 million went absolutely straight back to the Treasury. Not one penny came back to Thames Valley Police, which has spent £7 million prosecuting the case. So the lesson all police forces learn is if the FCA and the NCA and the SFO take on a case, who the hell is going to do it? Because we can't afford it. The police have had very heavy cuts over the last few years, and they simply couldn't afford to take on a bank which has very deep pockets, really almost unlimited pockets of its shareholders' money. Yeah. And they also have lawyers who have a vested interest in not paying anything back, but stringing everything out. So I don't think the situation has improved. And I think at last the NCA may be doing something about it. But half the people in the NCA are the people responsible for Operation Midland, I might point out.
Ian, let me come to you with your northern hat on. What's been happening the last couple of years? Has anything been resolved?
I think they've been kind of cherry-picking some of the victims to give the impression that the banks are behaving in some way graciously or honourably in terms of restitution and compensation for people whose lives they've destroyed. So there have been significant instances where people have received compensation. I think Anthony's alluded to that. But there's still a hell of a lot of people who were badly treated or whose businesses were deliberately destroyed in order that the bank could seize their assets, who haven't. So it's a very partial system of restitution. It's almost like a divide and rule type process which the banks are engaged in. And obviously this has been examined by things like the Cranston report. And Cranston is a High Court judge, or is that correct? I think he's a High Court judge, and I think he examined what HBOS / Lloyds had done to compensate the victims of the HBOS Reading fraud, which Anthony was talking about. And he found they've been doing it incredibly unfairly and incredibly badly and sloppily, basically. So there's no real indication that the banks have changed their ways. And what really worries me is the FCA, which Anthony also spoke about, the Financial Conduct Authority, a new entity created by George Osborne in 2013, which initially was led by a KPMG accountant, John Griffiths-Jones, and is now led by Nikhil Rathi, who's the former head of the London Stock Exchange, whose real remit is marketing London as a place for financial things to happen, like IPOs. So Nikhil Rathi is not in the slightest bit interested in ensuring consumer protection or clamping down on bad behavior, bad conduct by banks. It's not his aim. His aim is to get lots of business in so that we can have lots of IPOs in the City of London. You know, and I think that is actually a big warning sign. Also, when this episode with Megan Butler happened recently, Megan Butler was the director of supervision at the FCA who failed in numerous instances to properly regulate finance, especially to do with London Capital and Finance, which is a mini bond sales operation, and with RBS GRG. And when they were looking for a director of transformation at the FCA, who did they hire? Megan Butler, the same woman who had quite transparently failed in various instances that I mentioned. So that shows they've got no real desire to actually reform the FCA or have a properly functioning financial regulator.
Where are we with RBS GRG as a specific set of problems? I mean, Ross McEwen, head of RBS, has disappeared off to the Antipodes. We've got a squeaky clean new CEO. The bank's changed its name, going back to NatWest. But has anything been done about the GRG crisis?
Well, there was a sort of PR exercise a couple of years back, probably in about 2018, where they came up with incredibly derisory compensation for victims of the GRG scandal, which, as you know, has been described as the largest theft ever anywhere in the House of Parliament, in the House of Commons. There was a derisory, face-saving, public relations-driven compensation scheme put in place by Ross McEwen, the previous chief executive, but it doesn't go anywhere towards properly compensating the people who suffered. So it's wholly inadequate, and if anything, worse than what Lloyds/HBOS is doing with the Reading thing.
Dave says this is a network of corruption, not just a single. It's not just the banks. So how do we deal with a network of corruption? Is there any way which we could deconstruct this network and do something about it?
Well, you're probably spending less than 0.01% countering the size of the problem at the moment. It's got to be financed properly, and it would pay for itself. I think you've got to divide, have clear responsibilities lying between the various organizations, because otherwise they just shuffle it between each other and nobody is held responsible. So the Financial Conduct Authority should deal with misconduct. If there is forgery and fraud and everything involved, it should be the National Crime Agency or the police. And I think the National Crime Agency it's got a National Economic Crime Centre, but it's tiny. It should be very large. After all, the sums of money involved are vastly bigger than the drug industry, which is mainly what the NCA does. It should be bigger than that. It should be more than half the size of the NCA. And it should deal with all the frauds across national boundaries. The police at regional level, because no individual police forces are large enough, but at a regional level, they probably are, to take on frauds that are committed out of their area or where the centre of mischief is. And it should be financed properly. And I believe it would pay for itself. I mean, if that 60 million, which Lloyd should have been fined, had gone back to the police, we would have taken on a lot more frauds. But it's no good. And I get criticised hugely for dealing with frauds outside the Thames Valley. But if anybody can show me a sizable fraud that is committed in one police area, I'd like to know about it. The banks, the accountants, the lawyers, and the victims can be spread over 4 or 5 different areas in the country. But I think it's the clear lines of responsibility and financing it properly. And after a short period of time, it would pay for itself. And we've got to put a few of the major fraudsters in jail, because if we don't, there is no sanction on people. They will go on doing it. And when was a major fraud last investigated? It was done by Thames Valley Police, and that was 4 or 5 years ago, about 6 years ago when we investigated. Not one single big one has been tackled since that I'm really aware of.
Ian, why don't the politicians do something about this? I mean, if you've got this network of corruption and you can't penetrate it, surely that should be an issue that politicians take up.
Well, I think that the comment of Jesse Norman, the MP for Herefordshire, while he was on the Treasury Select Committee, was quite revealing, because when this whole GRG scandal blew up, which was basically that RBS had been massacring innocent companies around the UK in order to seize their assets. And it did it with at least 16,000 small and medium-sized enterprises. He admitted on TV in Channel 4 News that every single MP, and there are 650 of them, has a dirty little secret. And the dirty little secret is they've got hundreds of letters from SMEs in their constituency, which they're doing absolutely nothing about. And so I think that was quite revealing. I mean, luckily there are MPs like you, when you were an MP, who actually take these things seriously and try to make some difference. And there are loads of others. I'd say Kevin Hollinrate, even though he does come in for a lot of abuse from certain people, has done a good job in trying to expose some of these things. But the main problem, I think, is one of corporate capture. You have a corporate capture, or a capture of the political, regulatory, and civil service process by the banks. And I think this is the key to the problem. Somehow that needs to be addressed.
I've got a question here from Karen, who I know in other quarters in dealing with Scottish currency issues. And Karen asked a very specific question. Have we any idea how many suicides there have been, sad as it is, as a result of the kind of predatory behavior banks operated against particularly small businesses in the aftermath of 2008? Ian?
I personally don't know of any myself, but I've heard through through contacts and friends of several suicides of owner managers of SMEs who took their own lives because of what's been going on. But I don't have any statistics. And I would also note that one of the people who appeared in the film, Nigel Henderson, who was filmed at an SME, at a Cambridge Crime Symposium event, saying who among you, and he repeated who among you a number of times, has sadly died of cancer in December. So that's not obviously a suicide, but people do suggest that his cancer was brought on by the struggle that he's had with RBS over the past 15, 20 years.
Yes, Karen, when we were making the film, we came across a number of instances, and I was kind of reluctant to go into that in too much detail because I thought it was intrusive of people. And it's also very difficult to distinguish between people who sadly, tragically, actually took their own lives, and people who were just so depressed and ill as a result of long struggles with the banks that it wore them down, and that they were not suicides. And it does not appear on the death certificate, but they were clearly killed by the banks. And I think at some point it would, a serious investigation into this would be warranted, because I think the toll of human tragedy is just extraordinary. We've got a question from Roger. So Roger Mullen, I wonder if it's my old friend from Westminster, Roger Mullen. Roger asks, would one solution, one partial reform, be perhaps to remove the limited liability that banks hold? And we might ally that with a long discussion that I was party to as to whether banks should be forced to have some duty of care towards their small business customers, which they don't. Anthony, is there any way we can make legal changes in corporate law that might make the banks more responsible?
Yes, I think there are. I mean, one of the first ones I would tackle is the way the bank guarantees are run, and the way that they are able to impose NDAs when they eventually try and compensate people without consequential losses, usually. So I think the NDAs are unacceptable, and I think a lot of the ways they do bank guarantees are unacceptable too. And I think the ability to go for the assets of a company and the guarantee and the guarantor, what they were doing is going for the guarantor before they were even going for the assets of the company. And the two cumulative values would be vastly more than any loan was ever made. And that should be made illegal, certainly. And that was a case I think it was in a case about 20 years ago where that was set as a precedent that they could go for the guarantor before they went for the company assets, which of course allows them to go for vastly more than they could possibly ever be owed.
I think that some change to company law could help to rein in bad behavior in the banking sector and in the wider corporate sector. So actually Will Hutton, who written a good book called How Good Can You Be, published in 2015, looked at all this, and he made a series of recommendations about how company law can be reformed to ensure that companies do not solely prioritize the interests of shareholders, but also look at the interests of customers, employees, and other stakeholders. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. The chances of it happening under a Boris Johnson-led government are virtually zero, though.
Yeah, if I just go back to the bank profits, of course the banks have done incredibly badly, but their share price is a fraction of what it used to be. The only people who suffer, I have to say, I've said, are the shareholders and the victims. The people who profit are the people running the banks with vast bonuses, vast amounts of money being shoveled into the Cayman Islands and Jersey and the Virgin Islands, all undercover. I mean, if you suddenly get £50,000 in your bank account, the system wants to know where it's come from. If a bank moves 200 or 300 million between two sort code numbers between banks and off to the Cayman Islands, there is nobody to query it or question it, and they can do it the whole time. So I'm sympathetic with the shareholders, because I don't think, and of course, when a bank spends, vast sums of money into the hundreds of millions of pounds a year on lawyers, legal help and assistance, of course, what they're doing is they can spend their shareholders' money to protect themselves with impunity, and they waste shareholders' money on a huge scale. And it's personal protection, not bank protection, most of this.
It might be worth looking at the system we had in the 19th century, when you did have unlimited liability. And generally, at that time, banks were better behaved. But, you can't really wind the clock back.
Yeah.
The trouble is, if you have unlimited liability and the bank collapses, then you're in real trouble. I want to move slightly on from that set of issues, but it's allied. A couple of questions, one from Jess, talking about the whole issue of insolvency practitioners. And one other element, and I found this not something I knew particularly a lot about, but as an MP, I began to know more and more about it, that the whole issue of insolvency law, and the fact that the administrator goes in and takes over. The way insolvency practice is organised in the UK actually aids the ability of the banks to step in and seize the assets. So when I was an MP, when we were on Treasury Select and in the all-party group that we had looking into these banking issues, one reform that we prioritised, knowing that there was not a lot we could do quickly about the banks per se and about banking, was to see if we could reform insolvency law in order to actually protect more of the interests of small businesses. And we got we opened up a lot of discussion with Treasury and with it was then the Cameron government, and I thought we were making a bit of progress, and we had long discussions with the legal profession, particularly in England, who had similar concerns, and we evolved a strategy. But sadly to say, in the last 2 or 3 years, all that work has been lost. I suspect it's no great comfort to many of the people listening tonight that just the Brexit came along and Parliament became obsessed with everything to do with Brexit. And a lot of the other legislative agenda that we thought we had got going just disappeared. And in particular, the All Party group seemed to drop that as an issue. And so, I mean, I take what some of the questioners have been banging away at in the chat. The insolvency law is one of the things that allows the banks to do what they do, irrespective of the criminality and piracy of the banks. And if we could simply do some nuts and bolts changes to insolvency law to protect the interests, so that the owners just weren't swept aside, there was some provision so that we could try and restructure companies in a more sensible fashion before the banks pillaged them. That may be a way to go. And I think that's if there are any MPs or politicians watching tonight, I would heartily recommend that you go back to that agenda and see what you could do about it. Interest rate hedging products. What's happened to redress for mis-selling of interest rate hedging products?
This has been a long-running scandal, really. It first became evident in about 2011 when it became apparent that banks had missold these derivatives or hedging product, interest rate hedging products, to their SME customers. And the stories were quite shocking, because it was evident that they had duped the customer into buying something which they didn't need by overplaying the risk of interest rates rising when actually they were going to fall, and all sorts of other probably chicanery and tricks and deceit, and conned people into it, including saying that if they didn't buy an interest rate hedging product, their loan would be removed and they'd be left in the lurch. So this was a huge scandal, and eventually the FSA, as it then was, decided to do an investigation, and they did find that something like 80% of the interest rate hedging products which RBS had sold had been, inverted commas, mis-sold, as in sold, they were sold when they shouldn't have been. And there was some compensation that was paid out, but again, it was wholly inadequate. And it later emerged that Royal Bank of Scotland, which is now called NatWest, had doctored customers' files ahead of the review, so it could get away with paying out less in compensation than even the small amount that it was expected to pay out as part of that review, that FSA review, which did go ahead. So again, the banks have hardly covered themselves with glory. They've sold their business customers wholly inappropriate products in the build-up to the banking crisis of 2008 and afterwards in some instances. They've then fought tooth and nail to avoid any kind of investigation or proper review, and lied through their teeth about these products. I remember Sir Philip Hampton, who was then the chief executive of Royal Bank of Scotland, coming to Gogarburn to the AGM in about 2011, 2012, and lying through his teeth. He was pretending they hadn't sold any of these things or hadn't missold any of these things to their business customers. And then even when the opportunity comes to do the decent thing and repay the customers who've suffered, some of which have failed because of these products, they indulge in further chicanery, including inventing documentation and lying about what actually happened in the past with individual customers in order to minimize the payouts. So it's not a great story, to be honest. They don't come out of it at all well.
Are we supposed to have a financial ombudsman to deal with these things?
Yeah, well, there is.
I haven't heard anybody talk about the FOS for a long time. Is it still there? What's it doing?
Well, maybe Anthony wants to comment, but I would say, in my experience, where business complaints are concerned, the Financial Ombudsman Service is utterly useless. It has no interest in properly investigating the case from the customer's perspective. It is basically an agent for the banks. Maybe that's unfair, but that's my perspective. They may be better with individual cases, personal banking, retail banking, but with business banking, they're not great.
Yes, I mean, it's not an area that I'm an expert in at all. But I mean, the one thing that comes through absolutely consistently is the banks lie and falsify documentation the whole time. and on an industrial scale. And I mean, I think it's worrying. The Treasury Select Committee, when it looked at some of the files that were put together by the signature forgery campaign, it's not just signatures, it's whole documents. They asked the National Crime Agency to investigate it 19 months ago now. Well, at last, they have said, they've actually talked to somebody, but do you really need 19 months to assess this? In America, they would have prosecuted and people would be in jail by now. And the great thing is, a lot of these go back quite a long time. People are getting old. People's lives are being ruined. People are living in abject poverty because the system won't bloody well get on with it and do something about it.
To those of us who have been involved in this, and I assume that most people watching tonight have been victims, everywhere you turn is such a disaster that you begin to think you're going mad. And I mean, as Anthony says, the forgeries, people would come to me as an MP, and I get lots of people coming because their own MPs wouldn't deal with the case. People would come to me and they'd say, my papers were forged. Now, as an MP, right, you're trying to referee, you're trying to get the facts, you're trying to work it all out. And somebody comes and said, well, the banks diddled me, they forged the papers. Well, I mean, you have to have initially a bit of skepticism.
Yeah.
But then when 20 and 50 people come and say the bank forged the papers, you think, and they're very nice middle-class people, run their own businesses, being bankrupt, you think, there's something weird going on here. And can it really, then you go into a second kind of cycle of skepticism. Can it possibly be that the banks could systemically forge and engage in this kind of criminality on an industrial scale and nobody noticed? Where were the auditors? Where were all the security staff? Where were all the protocols? And you realize it's true. And then I think you deal with the FOS. This line of questioning came from the FOS, the ombudsman. The ombudsman would come along, you try and go through this. And anything you discussed, of course, with the ombudsman, they told to the banks because that's part of the rules. So the banks cover up. Or if you ask the banks for information through the FOS, they'd suddenly release, a billion files that nobody in, in a million years can actually read. Right. I mean, so you begin to get, I began to think about getting a gun and shooting somebody. And I mean, it appears, and I hate to say this, that 2 years on since we premiered the film, we're not making that much progress. So I've got some questions. There's another line of questioning come in, which is, what do we do about all this? And a question from Chris: can we try and invent some form of stakeholder capitalism and banking that might make a difference? From Jim asking, and this is for us up here in Scotland, if we get independence, should we nationalise the banks? Not forgetting, of course, that RBS is, NatWest is still largely nationalised. Doesn't seem to do very much good. So, Ian first. Is there some general way? Do we need a different kind of banking? I suppose is where this question is taking.
More diversity and ownership. In Germany they have three main types of banks. They have the national, the global banks like Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank, and we know what Deutsche Bank has become. And then they have the Landesbank, which are the regional banks, and then they have Sparkassen, which are more local savings banks. And it may not be ideal, but actually that system of having various types of ownership of banking institutions may bring about more focus on the customer and less playing fast and loose or game with rules or gaming the regulations. I think, having huge global swaggering behemoths like RBS/NatWest became in 2008, and it was the largest bank in the world for a year between 2007 and 2008, is a disaster, because in that instance they basically can capture, in my view, the regulator, and they can capture the government, and they can capture civil service or whatever else, and I think that is allowing banks to get that big is basically very dangerous. So one good thing that has come out of the crisis since '08 is that RBS is now a hell of a lot smaller than it was in when it collapsed in September 2008. I can't remember the figure, but it's probably about 20 to 30% of the size that it was in terms of balance sheet at the time of its collapse. Yeah. Other people believe maybe we should have we should have actually been much more rigorous and broken up RBS in the wake of its collapse into 3 or 10 or 20 small banks. But actually, the experience suggests that doesn't necessarily work, because that's been done. They tried that with what was called Williams and Glyn's, and it didn't work. It did happen with TSB, but then within a few months, TSB was acquired by a Spanish bank. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But yeah, I think diversity of ownership is probably one way of resolving this.
Yeah. Can I just come in? I think very often we don't actually need many more rules or things. What we actually need are the current rules enforced. And the regulatory authorities, when you people them entirely with people from the organizations that they've just left, they're investigating themselves half the time. When you have the chairman of the Financial Conduct or Financial Reporting Council, was last job as chairman of Lloyd's and gave the auditors KPMG a clean bill of health for their audit of HBOS and Lloyd's. I mean, it's unbelievable. And as you said, the chairman of the FCA, his previous job was senior partner of KPMG when the audits of HBOS, Carillion, and the Co-op went on. I mean, you cannot put these people in charge of the regulatory authorities and expect the regulatory authorities to do anything about it. And if you actually look at the staff of the FCA, how many of them work for Lloyd's? You cannot have Lloyd's Bank sponsoring the City of London's frauds units. I mean, these things are unbelievable, but they're happening. And until you sort that out, you can make as many rules in Parliament as you like, but nobody enforces them. And that is the underlying problem, I'm afraid.
In 2002, the US government under George W. Bush imposed a new act called Sarbanes-Oxley, which was in the wake of Enron and WorldCom and numerous other companies which had failed because of accounting fraud. And it was a good, in many ways, it was a good act, Sarbanes-Oxley. But the way in which Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor, and Ed Balls, who was a key figure also, responded, was to rub their hands with glee and say, hey, we can get all these financial businesses and we can get investment banks to come, we can get IPOs to come, we can make the City of London the largest financial centre in the world again. It's a fantastic opportunity. So they embarked on what's been called the race to the bottom. And I mean, I may be wrong, but I think that was really a moment when this whole process of standards falling, regulators being useless, and potentially government being captured, got underway, or certainly accelerated.
Nobody out there thinks, those of you who are in Scotland, that it's going to be instantly better if we get independence, unless we heed some of the warnings that Anthony has given us. If you look at who was appointed to run the Scottish National Investment Bank, it's appalling. People involved in a lot of these scandals. Under the Growth Commission report, SNP Growth Commission report, the structure of the banking system that we'll get mirrors exactly the City of London, all the same rules, all the same institutions. And we will inevitably, on past practice, simply appoint bankers who have failed to run the institutions we set up in Scotland. We have to change this.
Yeah.
The original proposal for the National Investment Bank was that it had an operational board, but it had a supervisory board which set policy, which was not bankers. And that's been lost, and we have to reimpose that. And I personally think that when we set up our own, when we get independence, set up our own central bank, it should not be independent. There's no such thing as independence. Central banks are either run by politicians, appointees who are democratically accountable, or they're run by bankers who are accountable to nobody but banks. So I think there's a big debate to be had about how we run the banking system in an independent Scotland, because just being independent doesn't make an automatic change unless you learn the lessons of what's gone wrong at the Bank of England and FAWS and FCA and so on. Right.
Yeah, well, Andrew Wilson's Growth Commission report was incredibly disappointing because he didn't actually reconsider any new ideas as far as regulating finance or the financial system was concerned. And it was incredibly weak and actually feeble. And it was almost like he'd written it with a view, with one sole purpose in mind, which is not to frighten Baillie Gifford and other large financial institutions, which are still based.
Well, he told me he talked to the bankers, and that's why it is the way it is. Also, there was a report on how to frame a Scottish regulatory and banking system, particularly the regulatory system, learning the lessons from City of London, which went to the Growth Commission. I know that because I wrote it, and it just disappeared down a crack in the floor. Right, so I want to, because Samir's been sitting here patiently, and we've all enjoyed watching the film, and some questions have come in about the film. What we had one rather nice question, which was, I mean, how did you feel? Was it difficult interviewing and being with these people who had suffered? How did you form a relationship with them?
I feel, I made films about Bosnian genocide that won some international awards. I made fiction film about child labor in India, about Syrian refugees, and when you, I think empathy is major source for inspiration for making films. And first, when my friend George Kerevan, co-producer and my dear friend Paradiso Films, came as MP to me in Treasury Select Committee, I couldn't believe in this story. It's like happening in some small country, banana republic, where you think, is this really possible? So we randomly really selected characters who would represent large scale of this fraud. And when we made it, we offered to Channel 4, who said they looked at the subject but they could not make it. And BBC responded that film has wrong tone. I actually think what somebody said in a film, what banks forget, that actually taxpayers bailed out their business. They were running really bad business, and then huge amount of taxpayers' money went to their pockets, and then they decided to actually the only way to make more money is to do what they did, what was presented in the film. And I have to say the real hero here is Anthony Stansfeld, who actually is really decent person and doing his job as police commissioner. And actually, I was expecting him to be awarded like MBE or OBE or Sir Anthony Stansfeld.
No chance of that.
but instead, latest news in February that KPMG is putting complaint against Anthony Stansfeld for the reason that he left his Thames and Valley police constituency to chase the banksters in London. So you cannot do that. You're a policeman, but you cannot come and prove us guilty. So I'm really sorry that this film did not capture everybody's stories. And unfortunately, for the last 2 years, it was premiered in House of Commons, and it was erupted volcano of applause and other victims coming in tears, wanting to tell their stories. And unfortunately, this was utterly small budget. And I have to thank to all contributors and people who put money in the film and supported this, including partially Screen Scotland as well, and private investors and the contributors who give services for nothing. So the point is, I wish I can tell everybody's story, but after all this journey, film is available on Vimeo on demand, VOD, and I actually protected film because we were searching for a larger audience, and there is news that actually lately we are talking to broadcaster who will show it in for around 1 billion audience worldwide. And it's a broadcaster international, and it will be in 5 languages. So let's hope that this story, I actually think that this is too big subject, that if banks have to pay out, the victims, they will just bankrupt again. So government will protect their criminal behavior, and from what I've heard from you. And another, we make fiction as well. Another film that we are working on just now is about gambling. This is a fictional story, but it will tackle another area that's totally uncontrolled. And actually, as somebody wrote in a comment I was reading on a site, that as we are talking this, they're selling loan, but as we are watching this, they're giving you opportunity to gamble, so etc. So that's the next project that I think will be interesting for British audience.
What's your next project, film project, Samir?
Well, as I said, the feature film is gambling, but at the moment I feel that British media is somehow becoming, a bit of state media. BBC has appointed somebody who is party donor as a chairman, ex-Goldman Sachs, banker, and I think the way immigration is controlled, and at the moment we are tackling Islamophobia, and we are making film about women who choose to wear hijab. And if we don't respect freedom of religion and expression, we will have things like that. We will make society within society in UK, and then we will actually support people who radicalize minority of Muslims in UK. But mind you, in my research, I find out that 70% of UK media reports negatively on Islam. So Muslims are portrayed as criminals, terrorists, and law-abiding people, which is connotation that most of Muslims are not. So if you're a law-abiding citizen, you are this kind of things lead to genocide. I cannot tell you how disappointing it is that I love this country. I've been citizen for 25 years, and I've been taxpayer as well. So, we need to, I love Scotland, of course, that's where I live. Edinburgh is our home, but I love all UK. And I want to contribute to this society by making these films. And honestly, if you think that big companies can afford to show these films, you need to question that. So let's hope we will find way to close the deal with this large broadcaster, and that people see this. I'm not representing victims by all means. And I'm really sorry what happened after this film, that some victims got compensated. I think Noel Edmonds and some others, they got payout, and I think film has put pressure. They're even changing the names, but never the nature, RBS is NatWest, Clydesdale is Virgin Money, and I'm sure that Lloyd sooner or later will change the name. I cannot believe that, but they're the same guys, they're same corrupt bandits, and the structure is not to help people in simple way that we each other help support money. And I know I'm maybe too much of a left wing tonight, but I don't see how there is no closure to this. I'm sorry. I can only make films, but honestly, am I happy after all this? I mean, I'm saddened for each individual and all others that I didn't tell the story. There is potential for a series of these films, but I'm afraid that UK government will not. I mean, it's like, where does liberty start and where does it stop? We can criticize China, we can criticize Iran, etc. But we need to deal with things with rubbish in front of our own door.
I never like to finish without knowing what people are doing next. Anthony, you've had this wonderful. Folks should look Anthony up on Wikipedia, because he's had like 5-6 careers. I only discovered tonight, because I'm a passionate aviation buff, that he worked for Britain Norman. I hadn't realised that. We'll have a discussion about that another time. Long lost aircraft company in Britain. But Anthony, how long have you been Crown Commissioner now?
I'm in my 9th year now, and I stepped down. I think it's May the 10th I officially stepped down. Unless I'm asked to do something, and I have expertise in a number of areas, I shall probably retire. But I should be rather bored.
Oh, right? Never. I think you should go and stand for something else. Anyway, thank you so much, Anthony. And I'm sure there will be yet another career. I'm sure. Ian, what have you got another book on the stocks?
Yes, I'm working on another book, but I can't really talk about it tonight, I'm afraid.
Okay, it's a secret.
Could I just say, if I may, please spread the word and tweet about this film. You know, it's a subject that matters. You know, I would be happy to release the film for free, and that was always an option. We're keeping it with reason because I want everybody to see. But please do tweet and do say that you have seen, that people should see and be aware of this large-scale, unbelievable theft.
I think it would open a lot of people's eyes. You know, a lot of people who had no knowledge of what the banks have been up to over the past decade or more, were they to watch this film, they would be pretty shocked. They would have no idea that this sort of thing was going on.
Yeah. And
even when
it extends so far beyond the banks. I think that's the worrying thing, into the accountancy companies and the legal practices, and actually through the law courts as well. And some of the law courts, insolvency courts, where people are being bankrupted. You have to say, does the sort of the temporary judge come from the same chambers as the barrister? Either the courts are incredibly naive, or something is not right in a lot of these courts, and I think that is really worrying.
It is possibly that the scale of this banking heist has just been so great that people, I've seen this in the media, we worked very closely when we were making the film with senior people in BBC and Channel 4. And their ability to explain this fraud on such a gigantic scale, people just think it cannot possibly be true. But I think most people watching tonight will know it's true, and we still have a lot of work to do. And as Samir says, we couldn't give everyone's story because there's tens of thousands of stories. We did our best to try and give some examples that would keep the debate and open up the debate. We're not giving up, you're not giving up, Anthony and Ian is not giving up. So